Hello, everybody. Okay, so the next thing is actually related to this, but I know a number of you are moving into a module where it's composing to context stimuli and working from that. And um, I've always found projects like that to be really meaningful for my students, particularly when they can choose something or it's more of an engaging prompt than kind of replicate musical form, starting from theory and creating, or about learning a particular technique, because it leaves a little bit more openness to interpretation and bringing yourself into that. And I've always found that, for me, even when I was composing as a younger kid, I was pretty good at coming up with like little musical ideas, but I didn't know how to develop them. That was one of the things that was hard for me. I could listen to a piece of music, but I didn't know how to break it down and listen for development, and I didn't have a lot of resources for that. And so I think particularly when you have prompts like context stimuli, it's useful to think of it in terms of narratives and stories, to kind of move through, whether that's a soundscape or you're using electroacoustic means, recording instruments or sounds and putting those in, or using virtual instruments to work with that. And a number of composers that I know actually start a process by graphing out a musical architecture. So a number of music, I was at a seminar with Alan Menken, the composer who does a lot of Disney musicals. And whenever he sits down to approach composing a musical, he will sit down with his lyricist collaborator, and they will create a, a virtual, sit down at a table and create an emotional arc of the story. They'll create the story, they'll create a map and a thing and say, okay, we want to have the climax be here, we want to have it have this mood and this theme, this is the subject, and we want to kind of go here. And they map that out. And then they start composing to that map or to that architecture with that. And even if you have a stimulus at the beginning, I think it's helpful to think through those structures and to go from them. And one way that I did a similar kind of introductory approach that was really low tech at the time, this is actually a project that I did with my lower secondary students back in 2005, in that was we first started listening to pieces of music to figure out what were their architecture. So, what was the emotional arc? How did it move over time, to give them just some different ideas and prototypes of ways of approaching this. And so the project that I'm going to share with you was actually introducing I guess they were age 10 and 11 students to Stravinsky's Rite of Spring. And again, I look at this as more of a, it's not a piece that follows traditional classical form. But there's a lot of repetition. There's a lot of ostinati. There's a lot of interesting things happening, dissonance, and playing around with that. And I chose this piece because I was having my students compose with loop-based software. At the time, we were using Acid Music Studio, but I know now a bunch of you have BandLab and things like that. And the reason why I chose the Rite of Spring was because Stravinsky writes with a lot of these ostinatos, which are very similar to the loops that our students would encounter working in a program like BandLab and working with that. So what I did was I broke the students up into different small groups and gave each of them a piece of A4 paper and just had them draw a line across the paper in the middle. And I had them put ×0 at the left. And we chose different movements of the Rite of Spring. Each one was about a minute or 2 minutes long. And different groups had different movements. And then they looked through the musical timeline in their player, and then how long did it last? And that was the time they put at the bottom line. And so the first pass of kind of walking through this, we wanted them to kind of create their own interpretation by listening to this architecture. And then the task was then, after they created these maps, was to go into the software to then find loops that fit their map, to kind of recreate a version architecturally of that. And so this is a little blurry, I know, but you can kind of get a sense. This is a first draft that one set of students did. They would put little marks. And so the first assignment to them was, listen to the piece of music, and anytime you hear the music change, put a mark and note the time. And so they would do that over time. And then because this was a piece of music that had a story perhaps behind it, with that above the line, I wanted them to write, what did they hear in the music? Maybe that was an instrument. Maybe that was a technique. Maybe that was something in there. And then below the line, write their interpretation of what might be going on in the story with that. And so here they would kind of go through and do that. And over time, they had to revise these each week. So they would go back and listen again and make it more and more complex. This, I know it's too blurry, you can't see, but they were over time with scaffolding and us discussing, they would apply more of the terminology they were learning and describe more and more through sharing with their group and putting onto their individual maps what was happening, to the point at which then they're actually going through and on their third version, they're going through and listing out what do they want to add to make it their own with that. And so this video you can kind of walk through. And so each individual group created an analysis for each for 4 of the movements from the Rite of Spring. They composed music together for each of those sections, and then we brought them all together as a creative project, and then we had to have conversations about how do we connect these 4 movements together, because they were composed in isolation. So we had some very interesting conversations as a class about, do we just stop part 1 and go right to part B? Do we create a transition? Do we take material from part B and bring it into part 1, or from part 1 into part 2? And then eventually our group created composition. This composition was then given actually to our dance students who created original choreography, because they were also studying cellular biology and division and spring and all of that. And so it then was programmed on a spring concert celebrating the centennial of the school around the rituals of spring and working with that. And so you can watch the whole video as you go through, but the key idea here is just a simple timeline with revisions above and beyond. Then you end up with an architecture map, particularly from a piece of music that doesn't have a formal structure, that might be around, here it is, it's spring, we're going to have these rituals, we're going to play around with these things. How did Stravinsky interpret that? What was his way of creating and enhancing that story, and then putting that together over time? And so the idea from here is that through analysis projects, or even just free drawing, they could start off and come up with a different map and a program. Then there's at least an architecture that can help them maybe develop their ideas and move that over time for that, and using those graphs for both listening and then graphs for creating as a way to kind of not just respond to, it's springtime and it's warm, start creating a soundscape that does that. But yes, it's a springtime and it's warm, and then what happens? And then what happens? And I often find that it's useful to students that if you can help them out with a structure, then they can kind of go in and section that out and add it in, and then work towards and revise and work from there. So similar approach to before with listening and creating, but I'd like to open it up to see if any of you are doing similar kinds of things, or if you have any questions about that kind of approach. We'll open it up again.
What I do with my students is they will do something on band lab. Yeah, in which case they will play with sounds. And the explanation will then come in them explaining the choice of materials and what they do with it. So not similar to the timeline graphs.
Okay.
Yeah.
I have another approach that I would use with my students, particularly when they were working with digital audio workstations, was inspired by, if back in the days when we used to watch movies on DVD rather than Netflix, you often could watch it with the director's commentary. And so I would often have my students add an extra track where I would ask them to narrate their thinking as the composition was going along. And then they would turn into me 2 different versions, the one that was just the pure music, and then the one that had the audio reflection, either before maybe, or after, or during. And then I would post both of those to the class to listen to, so that a student could listen to another student's finished composition or their narrated one. And that was just another way, because the students were in there, to get them to put their reflection into the DAW assignment itself, and it also was an opportunity to help them refine, particularly thinking about professionally about podcast production. Sometimes you want to have the music in the background, but hear the speech. So we use that to listen and go back in and follow up on how do you set a good speech level if music is in the background. How do we hear speech with music? We also used it for ways of improving capturing the microphone and the live instrument while they had a recorded background. So again, things that apply to electroacoustic kind of recording and capture. And so that also became, even though the pedagogical goal initially was about having them reflect and make their thinking audible, in that it also became about teaching the content of how to record the voice well, how to avoid, adding, going over and saturating and clipping the sound, and working with that. So particularly if you're doing more instrumental kind of compositions that don't have voice, that's another way of adding that content in and reinforcing that.
Yeah, thank you for the idea.
Yeah.
Actually, for MGS right now, for my students, for composition, I am getting them to do theme and variation. This is Muchao, by the way. So actually the structure is already quite clear. So it is more of how to get them to vary their ideas. So actually what I'm doing is try to teach them musical devices and variation at the same time. So I am suggesting to them how to use the devices to do the variations. But in terms of the timeline itself, it's quite simple. The theme is just 8 bars. So for the structure, they don't really have challenges with the structure itself.
Thank you.
Thank you.